So you're a Pennsylvanian, kind of, sort of. You went to university in Pennsylvania, at least.
I lived there for 10 years, yeah.
I grew up in Lancaster,
Oh,
Amish
you did?
country.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. So you're used to horse buggies around.
I'm used to horse buggies around.
Yeah.
Yeah. Why did you went to just you go
Well, I
to
was a professor at Penn for a decade.
great. Of neuroscience? What were you teaching?
Yeah. Cognitive
Great.
neuroscience.
What was it that got you into that originally? I feel like it's such a sexy subject and title. To say I'm a neuroscientist, I feel like that was my dream for a while. I fell short, obviously, but that was something that I would love to have that on a business card, like neuroscientist. Anyway, you can really put it anywhere on the card.
Wow. No, I mean, it was really just, I thought I was going to be a medical doctor for a long time growing up. There was just one big problem, which is I didn't like being in hospitals at all.
Yeah.
And I lucked out that one of my kind of candy striper rotations was in a brain injury unit. And that was it. That was like it changed my whole orientation toward what was interesting to me.
Hmm.
Meeting people that were actually changing their own brains through their therapeutic process.
Hmm.
And people that couldn't move at all, being able to move their hands and limbs. It was exciting to me to think that there's this thing that we can reprogram through our own experience and behavior.
Hmm. What was it about that specifically? Was there anything in relation to you in particular that you wanted to reprogram, or was it just a novel?
No, at that point, it was just an amazing aspect of this very complex um, structure that we happen to carry around. I was always interested in psychology, and now that I look back on it, like I've been talking to more people about this, my personal history. When I was in 10th grade or something, I took courses at the University of Chicago in like moral psychology, and I can't believe my mother was kind enough to drive me to Hyde Park every weekend. But I was just always interested in sort of consciousness and psychology. So the brain piece just really fit. It was like, okay, this is the route by which these really amazing processes emerge. So at that point, it wasn't really regarding changing my own brain. It came in later in my life, but initially it was just a curiosity.
Something I've asked many folks in the past that come from like a neuroscience background or mindfulness background in general is if your definition, what is your working definition of the mind, and has it shifted over the years that you've been studying the concept?
It's a great question. My definition of the mind. Wow. I don't think I'm going to be all that articulate
That's okay.
regarding this. It's
We'll just edit it out. We'll just
yeah, that would be good.
I'm just joking.
That was mean.
Yeah.
So I think that it's really regarding the contingent nature of processing. And that part, the contingent part, right? So that there's these processes that happen. There's some mystery regarding how it goes from neurons firing to networks functioning together to the emergence of the phenomenology of our moment to moment conscious experience. But it's still to me a mystery that I love that part of it. The part that I think probably has shifted from the perspective of learning about contemplative practice is really understanding what moment to moment contingencies are. And maybe I'm sidestepping your question, but for example, when you start understanding that you can pay attention and actually experience your life at a more granular temporal scale, like the actual ebb and flow of your thoughts, your emotions, your conscious experience, as a scientist, you get really like, oh my gosh, our time scale is so off.
Hmm.
Like we're looking when we look at things like functional MRI and uh, which is essentially the gold standard right now of how we're going to understand the brain in an alive functioning human. We're looking at blood flow. We're not even looking at neural activity directly. So we're
Yeah.
sampling at a rate of 1 to 3 seconds. But when you actually look at what's going on, even within the course of a second, using other methods like brainwave recordings, for example, there's at least 20 distinct states that can emerge over the course of a second that you can see in the neural activity. So it wakes you up to the realities of how much we don't know regarding this thing you asked me about, the mind or brain.
Yeah.
But it's expanded my respect for how much we don't know, including the big questions like what is consciousness? Is the brain the factory for consciousness or the antenna for consciousness? Those big questions, I would say I'm still um, open. I'm
What
open.
would how would you define the brain and the function of the brain?
Well,
Because I feel like,
the brain is easier, right? It's actually the set of structures and processes that are at play moment to moment within this handy casing we call the skull. So it's that, I mean, I don't find that problematic. I probably find consciousness a little bit more problematic because we're getting a
hmm,
handle on it, but we have a long way to go in terms of actually understanding what the heck it is.
yeah, how dependent or interdependent is the brain in relation to the rest of the body? So if you look at the skin, they both are derived from the same dermal layer from an
Oh,
embryological perspective,
the
and then
brain
there's,
and the body are highly, not even, I would say, you can't even say linked. They are the same.
of course,
They're the same.
yeah,
I mean, in some sense, your fingertips are your brain. The ends of your eyeballs are your brain. So, I mean, obviously, there's specific distinctions that we make with regard to peripheral and central functioning, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. But this is all highly interconnected, highly dynamic, and interdependent with regard to moment contingencies. So it's a complex system.
yeah. I feel like there's a metaphysical lens that you could perceive the body through, and then when you start using terms like mind or mindfulness, suddenly it just jumps into that like quantum reality. But I wonder how much of a
Say more. Wait,
limitation.
I'm not sure I follow you. Say more about that. That
So
sounds
we have
interesting.
so we have like these deductive representations of the body. You break down the brain exists in the vacuum, and then the skin, and then the organs, and the liver, and the heart, and then science comes up with the gut brain axis, and then maybe the gut brain skin axis, and we start to create these connections when ultimately the body has no idea what the hell we're talking about. And so, but then when you jump into the mind realm, then all of a sudden it's like, whoa, hold on, now it's like a different game in a way. But I wonder if perhaps that the tools, the processing tools that we've um, learned or gathered in Western culture is almost like a limitation to be able to have a broader conversation of what the mind is, because we come from a didactive or a deductive space. Like that's where our mind is set in elementary school, middle school, college. It's deduce, deduce, deduce. That's Western medicine. That's allopathic medicine. That's science. And then we try to start to stumble into these bigger conversations. And I think it's great to have that linear structure, and then the deduction, and it works really well for a lot of things. But there's an interesting jump where you come into mind. You're like, oh, like do we even have the tools to really perceive that? And if and
Yeah,
if we don't, how do we gather the tools? Or maybe, does it even matter?
this is a fun space that you're talking about, and I would say, just at the very concrete level, thankfully, I think we're moving in a better direction to understand the interconnected, interdependent nature of things, and the the parsing of things has to be undone. And even if you think about, in particular, brain, let's just talk about the brain. So when I was in grad school, before really fMRI was a thing, which is, gosh, that's not that long ago. Um, when we learned about different functions, it was literally like different brain parts did different things. And it was so funny when my daughter was probably, I don't remember, 4 or 5 years old. She came to the lab one day, and I had one of those plastic gimmicky brain models that I was used to use for demos in class. And I'm busy doing something, so she's on the floor playing with this thing, taking it apart. And then all of a sudden, she would raise up her little hand and say, "What does this do?" And I'd say, "That lets you see." And then, "What does this do?" "This lets you hear." And I'm like, "Oh my goodness, I'm doing the exact thing that my training gave me that I had to realize was so primitive and wrong." And so at some point, I stopped what I was doing. I got down on the floor with her and I actually tried to explain to her really how the brain works. And she happened to be a gymnast, so I was like, "Okay, well, what body part do you need to do a cartwheel?" And she was so cute, and she's just like, "Well, you need your hand, but you need your arm," and like she's talking me through the whole thing. And I was like, "Okay, well, what do you have to do with these body parts? Well, they have to go in the right order, or else you're not going to do a very good cartwheel." And I was like, the brain is just like that. All these different pieces, they have to talk to each other and they have to work together in this manner that allows them to talk at the right time, or else we don't get to do things like see or hear. And even as like a 5-year-old, she understood that. And I'm like, if we had been taught this way of understanding the brain, I think a lot of different kinds of discoveries would have happened.
Hmm.
I'm just bringing that up because, as a criticism of my own field, that's only recently that even with functional MRI, where we can look at the entirety of the brain, that we can understand that it's functional brain networks. It's networks that are doing things and networks that are actually battling things moment by moment for us to have the phenomenal experience that we're having.
Hmm.
And I think people can understand that. Most of us can get it. Like, oh yeah, okay, I can see that. It's almost like a subway map where you've got, you know, two trains can't be on the same track going in the opposite direction. Like there has to be some order to it and some coordination for these kinds of things to occur. And the same is true for the brain. So I don't know if
Yeah.
that gets at your question, but I'm certainly entirely sympathetic to the view that parsing and slicing and dicing is not the correct way that things actually happen, and it's not even appropriate to have our understanding around that conceptualization.
Yeah. But perhaps it's a necessary step to get to a broader understanding,
Yeah, yeah,
so I think it's easy for, the especially like the kind of like the new age community to damn all things that are Western and allopathic and linear, and it's too strict and too rigid. It's like, well, it's, yin yang, light dark,
exactly.
they both balance each other.
Yeah,
To
and even
have
if
that
you,
containment is valuable to be able to communicate, but then also, but if you are just, you stop at the containment, then you might miss like the magic.
yeah, I like that way of thinking about it. And even going back to that example with my daughter, every function that I ascribed to each of those little pieces she was holding up is correct. If you had brain damage or you had a stroke or a lesion in that part of the brain, you couldn't see or you couldn't hear or you
Yeah.
couldn't think. So
Yeah.
there's truth in that too. It's just the incomplete truth. It doesn't work alone.
I wonder what your perception is on where memory exists in the body. Like, where is memory? Is memory a fractal? Is it distributed throughout the brain? Is it distributed throughout the body? How does one explain when they're going to, say, some body work session, and all of a sudden they start having these various episodic memories start coming through, and now I'm weeping, and now I had this purging experience, and now I feel lighter, and my mind is more clear.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The embodiment aspect of any cognitive or conceptual memory we might have or thought we might have, etc., is real. And I think that's the eye-opening experience for many people when they're engaging in something like a body scan, for example. It's like there's so much information here that I've been missing, that I've had no idea was information and useful information. So, I mean, separate from the kind of cathartic experience that you're talking about, just in terms of practical functioning. If I meet somebody and all of a sudden, for not really any conscious reason, I have a little bit of tightness in my stomach, or they make me uncomfortable, and I can feel it at certain tension points I'm holding in my body, and I pay attention to that, that could be very useful information. And we know, for
Yeah.
example, that the body does remember very interesting. The body and sort of the emotional landscape can remember things that we may not consciously remember. So these early experiments of people that have been they're in some kind of a game scenario in an experimental context, and different individuals they're interacting with, some cheat them, like they take their money and they say they're one thing or another, and then later on at the end of the experiment, when they've been doing a whole bunch of stuff intervening, they might show them faces of these people,
Yeah.
and just how trustworthy is this person, or how, not even a question related to the cheating, let's say, just how much do you like this person, and they can start seeing that they can't explain why. They might not have even understood what had occurred before, but it changes the nature of how they approach them differently. So the constellation of our experience, whether it's we think we're making decisions and the emotional system can modulate that, or we think we're just our mind, but our body is completely aligned with that experience. I don't think most of us are awake to most of that most of the time, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah. How is your work in this field? Because you've been focusing on the field of mindfulness, which, essentially before it was a field to focus on. I wonder how your experience, how has that changed you over the years? Is there any definitive?
Oh, oh, definitely. It's changed me a lot. I mean, I would say that the whole reason I the need to go in this direction. And to be completely honest with you, I would say I was a real skeptic regarding any of this stuff. Like anything
Yeah.
mindfulness related, I thought it was probably not real. I couldn't point to it. I had a real cultural chip on my shoulder regarding it because I felt like, and especially from Indian culture, there's a lot of sexism in the culture, and I almost was like, no, I'm not going in that direction. Not interested. But I also had a big problem within my own sort of life, which was I was more of a stress case than I thought, and was experiencing a lot of crises with regard to my own attention. I couldn't keep my mind focused. I wasn't able to be in the here and the now. And it was affecting my ability to do everything in my life, including being a parent. And when I looked to my own field, when I looked to the field of attention research, I could not find any answers, which is what opened me up to like, okay, well, this is weird. This thing that you think you should be able to learn about, it's just about distractibility. How do we solve it? Thinking it's
Yeah.
some simple problem, not the one of the major human conundrums. And then a colleague telling me about mindfulness and then opening myself up to even practicing. What was really fun and really interesting to me is like, oh my goodness, this is why some of these practices have been around for thousands of years, because they're speaking to this fundamental lack of peace we can experience in our lives, and
Mm.
they're offering a path to experiencing it. So
Yeah.
in terms of my own work, it was such an interesting um, kind of revelation, like, oh my gosh, there's another way. There's another way to do all of this stuff. And paying attention in this particular way is different than anything that I had studied. So it fundamentally changed me in terms of the way I approach my life, frankly.
Mm.
I was not phoning it in. I was really connected. And that meant being connected to the pain. It meant connected to the fear. It meant connected more to the joy that I wanted to experience. And it was a categorical shift.
How do you connect to the pain? And what's the value in that been?
Oh, okay.
What does that mean? What does that look like?
Yeah. So, for example, what typically, I mean, it was interesting. First, I was completely oblivious to going back to the body. One of my wake up calls is that I realized like I had lost feeling in my teeth from grinding. And I
Yeah.
had no awareness of this at all. So I was constantly in physical jaw pain and I had no idea, like, oh, I'm doing this thing and that's a problem. And what does it mean? Not aware at all. So that was the first thing, is it brings an awareness of what we're actually doing moment by moment that might even be an unconscious thing we're doing. But let's just talk about pain in the emotional sense for a second, and how I would say it has helped me and helps me guide other people on what to do in our research studies with groups like, firefighters and other kinds of first responders and athletes, etc. The kind of default way of orienting to pain is to, if you're aware of it, to maybe deny it or suppress it
Yeah.
or try to fix it. So to take some kind of action to shift the content so that it's not problematic. And the shift that happened with mindfulness training is like, the existence of this actual experience doesn't need to um, require the next thing I do. Like, there can be pain, and it doesn't mean you have to deny or suppress it. There's another way you can orient to it, which is accept and allow. And the difference that it made as an attention researcher is that orienting to difficult emotions in that way allows you to have more ownership over your attention. It doesn't hijack you so that every moment you're trying to either push this thing away or you're paying too much attention to it so that you can't get on with your life. Recently, with one of the ways I would describe it is that my son just left for college like a couple years ago, and when he left, it was like this weird pain of like nothing I'd experienced before, like just sadness and missing him. And people talk about this empty nest thing, but it was like I didn't expect to feel this much discomfort around it. And it was a
Mm.
weird feeling because it couldn't be otherwise. I didn't want him to come home because I was unhappy, but it kept creeping in where all day long. So whatever I'd do, I'd kind of feel a little rush of sadness come in. And even in my practice, when I was actually doing a mindfulness practice in my daily routine, it kept coming up. And finally, I just said, okay, we're not doing this anymore. This is going to be the focus of my meditation. And I allowed myself to have the difficult emotion well up, and then I just was there for it. I wasn't touching it at all. I just allowed it to be present flooding my body, flooding my mind, and almost befriending myself as if it was a good friend going through some kind of pain. And it changed the way my day went. Essentially, it didn't keep creeping in. And when it would come in, it was softer. And I could say, yeah, here you are. You're here too. So that way of orienting to difficulty is just such a useful tool that I would have
Yeah.
never learned about if it weren't for this kind of practice.
Yeah. It seems like a big thing is renegotiating your relationship to judgment. So maybe not you, but I think people in general or me. So coming to that place of having a sensation or experience or a feeling and seeing it as information and being able to be with the information as opposed to identifying with it or judging it as I'm losing. Oh, I feel depressed. I feel, any of the sensation. That means I'm a loser. That means I'm, separate from the tribe. Now there's more disconnect and it just goes through this spiral. But I think there's an interesting balance between being honest with um, renegotiating that judgment, and then there's the other side of the spectrum where it might seem like that on the outside, but in fact, you're actually kind of venturing more into disassociation.
Hmm.
And so, I wonder if is that something you've
I,
observed at all, or did I
well,
explain that? Did I
yeah,
explain
say the
that
second
reasonably?
part about the disassociation. I wasn't following that one.
So it's like releasing attachment. That's a thing that's taught in every meditation class or yoga class, but still deeply being with the experience and
Hmm.
acknowledging the experience and being completely present with the experience. I think that sometimes I think disassociation can oftentimes masquerade as not attachment.
Ah, okay, gotcha. Yeah, in some sense, it's a denial of what's actually occurring, appearing like you're cool with it or you're
Yeah,
separate from it.
like positive vibes only.
Yes, yeah.
I've heard something that you have mentioned is if you're in a high stress situation, it can bring more stress and be almost like it can be exhausting to try to put on, a smiling face and try to come back into like a good mood and like, sometimes just not losing the battle of attrition is a win, you know?
Exactly. This is we know this from our own data, looking at
Yeah,
pre-deployment soldiers and them being taught positivity, and it's like, um, okay, well, you're probably not going to benefit in terms of protecting your attention, and
yeah,
unfortunately, that's exactly what we saw. And I kept seeing this sort of pattern of positive, this desire for positivity, even when the circumstances were quite high stress, high demand. Like even at the beginning of the pandemic, like people don't know what's going on. They don't know how long they were going to be away from work or how life is going to be disrupted, and then still saying things like, "I got to crush it." And I
yeah,
was like, maybe don't crush it. Maybe just be. Like it's adding a level of expectation and demand when your resources are likely to be much more depleted.
yeah,
And so that's why we think that positivity can be problematic under high stress circumstances, because attention, this precious brain's resource that you need in order to reframe and reappraise, is less available to you if it's actually being used in the service of dealing with the demanding circumstances. So you don't have that extra capacity to use to see things differently right now.
yeah,
And a better approach in that kind of depleted state, maybe to just allow instead
yeah.
of trying to fix.
So is that allowing? Is that the path towards getting into those deeper, more implicit parts of ourselves? Because I feel like the analogy that makes sense in my mind is that, our consciousness is kind of like an iceberg, and most of us are riding at that tip of the iceberg, and we kind of assume that very small little tip is like the boss and that's the everything. But then there's this deeper subconscious, submerged aspect of ourselves that in fact is running the show and has been for
Hmm.
probably the entirety of your life. Um, is there? Do you have one? Do you agree with that? And then the second part would be, how does one start to access that deeper implicit part to maybe start to change the deeper wiring of the way that we think and the decisions that we make?
Yeah, I guess I mean, I understand what you're saying. I guess my goals are much more humble
Mm,
because it's more like, I don't know if there's a deeper iceberg, but I know there's a lot of stuff I'm not aware of right now. I know that
yeah,
in my own mind, things are happening that I'm not paying attention to. Even my distractibility, even body sensation. So my humble goal would be get more out of this moment so that have more awareness of what is going on right now. And the more we can bring into our present moment awareness, the more choices we can make based on that information.
Mm,
I don't know if it's the case that implicit biases and looking at them is going to change anything about them. In fact, I would say probably not. I would
mm,
say just seeing your bias won't probably be enough to change the way you orient. But cultivating the cognitive control, the attentional control to say, this is not the way I choose to operate. So let's say, for example, some person in a company is um, made aware or probably has some indication that they are very sexist, just for example. But they know the principles of the company are, do not discriminate based on this, and they have that kind of ethical orientation of like, I don't want to be sexist. That's like not the right way to be. People should, so just knowing you have these tendencies and saying yes, they're present is not going to allow you to overcome. But having that at the front of your mind, in fact, I would say putting it in your working memory is another brain system that I study, and saying the way that I'm going to conduct myself in my decision making is going to be from a point of view where I'm going to be aware of these tendencies and I'm not going to allow it. I'm going to actually look at things much more carefully.
mm.
That's a different approach. It's saying, I don't really care if there is implicit bias. Explicitly, this is what's going to occur.
Yeah.
So I guess that's sort of my take on it is there's a lot we can do even with what we can more easily access.
Yeah. So how to, I love that. And how, because I think sometimes a person, like me, can get lost in the weeds of, some grand philosophical meandering, and then you're like, well, I'm just lost and, spinning my wheels.
No, but it's
And
good to bring it up to kind of challenge conventional thinking and then to actually even challenge the alternative view you've given. And I think it's what I'm saying is probably also challenging conventional view, but which I don't have as much. I just don't. I just everything that I know from the work that we do, et cetera, is going down the journey of trying to uncover everything implicit about you is um, it may not be useful.
yeah, and you
And
can,
instead
if
focus on the ethical framing of how you would like to orient your life and make the commitment to have the cognitive resources to do that every moment that you can.
yeah, that's like, I mean, you might get more of this in Florida than, where did you live before Pennsylvania? Where did you grow up?
Oh, I've lived everywhere. I was in California before that, North Carolina.
Oh,
I
good.
grew up in Chicago.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, okay. So probably less in Chicago, more in California. I don't know about North Carolina. Um, but being around circles of people that are perpetually doing the work, and they're never not doing the work. Like every time you talk to them, it's always this deep sigh of, "Ah, I'm doing the work." I'm like, when have you just been? Like you've never not like you can't just always do the work.
Yeah, I guess a part of me is exhausted by that. Like, and also, I guess the other question would be, um, is this project really about work? I mean,
Yeah.
is it really regarding an increase in the amount of doing or actually learning what it means to not do? I mean, really, that's a really a fundamental way to kind of shift. What does that even mean to not do? Because most people might say that feels really uncomfortable. What do you mean not do?
Hmm.
Yeah, what would it feel like to take an observational stance, to not speak and listen, to
Mhm.
really watch instead of take action? I mean, this is this is non-work, right? That might actually have a better impact on or a different impact on your
Yeah.
experience. So,
The thing that gets me, and I would think this would resonate with a lot of people, would be, I know what to do. Like I have access to my cell phone, which is in my pocket, which has all of the answers to humanity. You know, but I still make decisions that are suboptimal for my mind and my body and my life, and it's like I still press the buttons.
yeah.
So that that's when I'm kind of talking about the deeper iceberg and the implicit stuff. It's like, what's the deeper governor there, and perhaps the way to work with that is just keep on chipping away at the surface, and eventually that kind of through osmosis starts to
Well,
change
but
at a
I'm
deeper
saying
level.
I'm actually addressing the same point, and I'm saying there's a very straightforward way to try it is to watch. Watch your mind, watch yourself. Even if you're talking about, I can get on my phone and it has access, I have access to everything that I could solve, but I still sometimes make faulty decisions. It's like, take that to granular moment by moment view. Usually we can't do that as we're doing it, but we can try. So even like something as simple as scrolling for too long on Instagram and feeling icky about it. It's like, well, how do I not do that? I know I shouldn't. It feels icky after I'm done. How do I stop myself? Oh, I should just throw my phone in the trash. It's not going to work. Okay, I got to break up with my phone. No technology over the weekend. Probably not going to work either. So the answer is going to be something that people may not find satisfying, but is actually more doable in the long run, which is pay attention to every moment that you are interfacing with your technology.
Right.
So notice the urge to pick up the phone. Notice the face recognition unlocking it for you. Notice you pressing on the button. Notice whose website you go to, whatever you do. If you're really there with it, even if you don't say, I'm not going to do anything differently, I'm just going to check out what I do, it will start shifting the way you do.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that it's not that it's either or, but the observational stance that we can take toward our own life, I think will give us a lot more answers and more choice points than we probably allow for right now.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. Is that how about cigarettes and like very very apparent addictions like that? Because one of the pieces of advice that I've heard that I found interesting and I kind of align with. I've never well, that's not true. I was addicted to cigarettes like maybe 12 years ago or something, but it doesn't really feel a part of me anymore. Um, but is just that when you're smoking your cigarette, smoke the shit out of it. Like be with 100% of it. Feel it hitting your lungs. Like feel the texture of the paper in your fingers. Like don't bypass it.
Yep.
If you're gonna do it all the way. And it's like I wonder if perhaps there's something to that. Like we're kind of getting away with something, or we 80% do a thing because we have a guilt, which perhaps that's baked in from maybe religion or some kind of cultural indoctrination, like having a guilt around the things that we do. But what do you think
Well,
about?
even just what you just said. I mean, it's not even about, it's 100%. Maybe do it in the same way you always do it, but pay attention to every aspect of the full experience of smoking. And when you objectively have people do this, and this is very common for mindfulness-based smoking cessation programs, is applying that mindful orientation toward an automatic behavior in the same way I was saying to do with, your maybe my tendency to scroll more than I want to sometimes. When you do that, you start realizing like, ooh, this feels kind of gross, or this tastes bad. The actual taste of the cigarette when it's first in my mouth and the kind of smoky flavor is gross. So you start having more an evaluative quality regarding something that you probably were just not in. It was not in your conscious awareness,
Yeah.
and then that might loosen up your orientation toward wanting to change something. So I think it's the same approach, but again, even if you change nothing about your action, adding that awareness component in will shift what probably will end up happening over the long term.
Yeah. Would you be open to defining the default mode network?
Oh, sure.
Because I think that's become like a popular maybe since Michael Pollan's book or but I've heard that term thrown around a
Yeah.
lot. And
Yeah,
I'd be curious your what the default mode network is.
sure. So, to start off, like, this is something that um, comes up through like the history of neuroimaging. We had this in the early days, and I'll try to make the journey quick. In the very early
Or not
days.
or not.
Okay.
I'm happy for the roundabout journey. Yeah, please.
So in the early days of brain imaging, we were just trying to figure out what the heck's going on. Does this tool work in the way that we think it should? So, like I said before, in sort of the longer term history of neuroscience, most of our information regarding how the brain was organized and how it functions was through stroke and lesion. Like if somebody had a big hole in a particular part of their head, what could they not do? And so we wanted to get a reality check. Like, are the brain regions that are active when we have people do certain kinds of things in the scanner aligned with what our prior stroke and lesion work suggests? And one of those was when people are doing attentionally demanding tasks, do we see the frontal lobes activate and the parietal lobes activate? And so that was what was done. You go into the scanner, you have participants do attentionally demanding tasks, seeing little screen in front of them and pressing buttons with a magnetically appropriate joystick or console. And you'd have 5 minute or 10 minute blocks where they're doing something very attentionally demanding, like a little video game they play where they had to really focus. And then you say, okay, just rest now. And then you give them another 10 minutes to play. And they say, just rest now. So we had these, what's called a block design, where you had 5 minutes of, or let's say 10 minutes of task, 10 minutes of rest, 10 minutes of task, 10 minutes of rest. And the way you could see what brain regions were active is just look at the activity during the task and subtract away everything that's going on during rest,
Hmm.
because a lot of the stuff would be overlapping. And it was very exciting. This tool works. We see the frontal lobes light up when there's attentionally demanding activity that's required. And you saw that over and over again. But then people realized, oh, this is weird. There's this other network, this other set of regions that is more active when you tell people to rest. It's like, what is that? Rest is supposed to be like the baseline, the nothing, the neutral. And so people started asking, what is it? What is it that you're doing when we tell you to rest? And, undergrads would be like, oh, I'm thinking about how boring this is, or like, when is it going to be over? I'm so glad I'm getting paid. Gosh, what did I sign up? Why did I sign up for this? Like, they're going on and on with a variety of answers, but the common theme is the central character in all of these meanderings is them. It's self-related. So people started joking that maybe we shouldn't call it rest. We should call it rapid, ever-present, self-related thinking, because that's actually what they're doing. They're thinking about themselves when you put them in the scanner and say rest, which then we come to realize, oh, actually, when you interrogate self-related processing, um, internal attention, even memory for episodic, incidents that have happened in your life, it activates that exact same network. So, in some sense, the default mode is shorthanded as that is the default mode. By the way, the network that was activated during rest. The default mode means the network that tends to be activated by default. Like if you tell people to do nothing, that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The set of processes that are engaged are really these sort of self-focused, self-related, sort of mental meandering or mind wandering types of functions that exist.
And we're able to change the structural architecture of our brains and the functioning of these networks through the way that we point our mind, our consciousness.
Yeah, well, I would say for sure, moment to moment, if you do a task that's attentionally demanding, you're going to get, the central executive network to be active. If you say don't do that and just let your mind go, you're going to get the default mode to be active. And even when you have people do attentionally demanding tasks and they mess up, they make mistakes, you can see that actually in those moments, what happened was the default mode was more active. They were
Hmm.
offline, they went internal. So it started, it is the case that these networks tend to be antagonistic. So you can't be outwardly attentive and inwardly attentive at the same time. It's one
Hmm.
or the other.
Hmm.
And the
And
relationship and the fluidity with which you can toggle back and forth says a lot about your functional ability.
and those mistakes are what catalyze neuroplasticity, from my understanding.
No, not really. I mean, neuroplasticity is this view that it's a very fundamental view that the brain can change based on experience. So, and that experience could be continuing to ruminate every time something bad happens to you. Your brain's going to change in that direction.
Yeah.
Continuing to worry. I mean, it's neutral. It's agnostic with regard to the direction of the change. It's just the brain's capacity to change. The
But
exciting
would it change without a mistake though? Because if everything's working, up to snuff, up to par, then what would be the reason for neuroplasticity?
I don't really, it doesn't have anything to do with mistakes. It really is regarding what processes you're engaging in. So if you tend to do something that's very attentionally demanding and very attentionally taxing over and over again, the brain networks that support that are going to become stronger.
Hmm.
So it's not about an individual mistake. It's really regarding the kind of process that you do on a continual basis. It's very much like, physical activity. It's like if you tend to do an upper body workout, your calf muscles are not going to look stronger.
Yeah.
Whatever it is that you exercise and engage is going to be the thing that looks more robust in terms of its healthfulness. I mean, healthfulness meaning brain circuits that are, you can see me do the air quotes, but healthfulness just means those brain networks are going to be more active. They're going to be cortically thicker, more interconnected, functional with more fluidity. It doesn't mean they're good for you. Because,
Hmm.
like I said, if you decide every day I'm going to ruminate for 3 hours. You're going to be like the world's best ruminator or worrier. And the circuits of your brain that are responsible for that kind of functioning will look more active. And they may even
Bef-
look more robust in terms of their structure.
But even from a physical perspective, if you're doing a similar activity that your body kind of like learns, you'll plateau with that, and you won't be having the same gains until you introduce confusion, which ultimately is mistakes. And so, I'm not disagreeing. This is I heard this from I've been listening to a buddy called Dr. Andrew Huberman, and he's got a podcast where he talks all about this stuff. But um, that was I wonder, with what he was suggesting was mistakes potentiate neuroplasticity because it forces the body to change. I wonder from your perspective uh, what would potentiate neuroplasticity to a greater level? Would there be any like nutritional things a person could be taking?
I
Could it
mean,
be a
so
type of
and
training, a type of
yeah, I
thinking?
just want to kind of demystify neuroplasticity because this conversation is changing my brain.
Sure.
Anything you do impacts the brain. Now, will it be enduring? Maybe. Maybe what you say to me will significantly change kind of the background processing that happens. So now all of a sudden I'm more likely to think in a certain direction, which then ultimately leads to a structural change in my brain, which is the neuroplasticity that you're talking about. So
Yeah.
there's always this structure function relationship. Mistake is a very we're speaking about judgmental. It's it's we're I don't know what a mistake is, right? It
Right.
may be something disruptive that shifts the way you typically function, and maybe that's what you mean when you say mistake. It may be that this conversation introduced concepts to me that I'd never been exposed to, so now I'm more likely to think in a different way.
Yeah.
But there doesn't have to be anything wrong for that to occur.
Yeah.
I think the exciting part of neuroplasticity as it relates to mindfulness and healthfulness is that we know neuroplasticity can occur for the worse when you have, and even for the better, not having to do with any kind of contemplative practice. So if you going back to the thing that I was telling you about at the outset regarding my personal history, we know that if somebody has brain injury, there are going to be neuroplastic changes. Things are going to get reorganized. If they exercise their mind to try to recover function, that's also possible.
Yeah.
The thing that became exciting, especially with the tools of neuroimaging, is we could now look to say, can you continue exercising in a particular way and see improvements beyond just steady state healthfulness? Could you optimize certain brain networks? Could you, for example, if you have a propensity to do a lot of mind wandering and the default mode is active often and it ends up being a lot of rumination and worry and self-related focus, can you dial that down by a certain kind of contemplative practice that teaches you to notice that mind wandering and bring your attention back to what you're trying to do? I mean, that's essentially the kind of questions we're asking, and the answer looks like it's yes, you can. You
Yeah.
actually can train the brain to function differently. But I don't know if I would say there has to be something wrong with an event. It's just expanding the scope of the repertoire of what you might do that may shift things.
Yeah. And the language I heard wasn't mistake. It was error, which still you'd have to um, define what does error mean.
Yeah.
But an error could be like falling off balance, and your body has to
And,
correct
and this is
itself.
where maybe the relationships between body and mind, and at least brain neuroplasticity and physical plasticity, biological plasticity in muscles, etc., it may be different. It may be that there may be some ways in which they don't function the same way because
Hmm.
it's a probabilistic stress. It's a probabilistic kind of approach to the brain shifting in this way. It's not a
Hmm.
one and done. Structural changes don't just happen through a one-time exposure to anything. It takes
Right.
a while.
Yeah. And so is this your latest book, Peak Mind, which comes out when is it coming out? It's
October
not out yet.
19th.
October 19th. So we'll put this
Woo!
out. We can put this out probably right around that date. Is that what is the like the what's the nuts and bolts of Peak Mind? Does it get into some of these
It
conversations? I
does get,
haven't I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet.
yeah, absolutely. It gets into a lot of these conversations. But really, the intention was we've learned a lot over the last 15 years of work in my lab regarding the power of our ability to pay attention,
Hmm.
the vulnerabilities of this very precious brain capacity, and how certain kinds of people in certain professions that experience high stress over long periods of time are vulnerable to these problematic exposures. And I had no idea when I was writing the book that we'd end up having a global pandemic and all of us would be in these volatile
Yeah.
and uncertain kind of situations. And then we've come to some really practical solutions. Oftentimes people in the context of knowing that I do work in mindfulness would be like, well, I don't have time for that, or I can't go away on a 1 month retreat. How much do I have to actually do for it to make a difference? Well, when we're talking about service members and firefighters, that had life or death consequences. If their attentional lapsed and they were about to be deployed, you don't want that kind of mistake. So we became very interested in like a rigorous approach to get us to a minimum effective dose for these high stress populations. And and we've established that. And that actually is part of the subtitle of the book of 12 minutes a day. So what we found is that under high stress for certain kinds of groups, practicing as little as 12 minutes a day of mindfulness practices protected attention from these vulnerabilities.
Hmm.
So the intention for writing the book was to offer that to more people, to offer these very practical solutions from the framework of the brain science of attention. And I would say most people that have been writing about mindfulness or studying mindfulness or practicing mindfulness are not typically thinking about it from an attentional perspective. So it was a new way in that I was offering.
Hmm. And is the 12 minutes, is there something magical about that number? Is there some minimum effective dose to 12
So
minutes?
that is what I'm saying is the minimum effective dose. So in our studies, what we did is we told people to practice 30 minutes a day. Most of them did not, but then we got their honest account of how much they were actually practicing. And over a 4 to 8 week interval, what we found was only those that practiced 12 minutes or more a day were actually benefiting with regard to their attention.
Hmm.
So less than 12 was not really resulting in a benefit. So that was sort of a critical point. And then we did other studies in which we offered 12 minutes only. Many more people did this versus asking them to do 30 minutes a day. So it
Right.
became a practical solution. And also, 12 minutes held up as like, yeah, when they do that 3 to 5 days a week, it's beneficial. And then the other part was also interesting, which is the more they did beyond that, the more they benefited. So very much
Yeah.
like physical activity.
Do you know, I feel like this would be really hard to be able to measure, but I wonder if there's some baseline of seated, silent, introspective, observing your breath kind of meditation a person can do to get to a point where they have the momentum to integrate a more intentional, attentive, lifestyle. So it's kind of like their life becomes a meditation. Do you know what I'm saying? I wonder if there's what do you think about that?
I mean, I think that if we could quantify what an integrative, attentive life is,
Yeah, sure.
then we might be able to get a handle on it. I mean, the
Yeah.
funny thing is when you ask people, like, how do you feel different? You were asking me that at the start. How do you feel different after you started practicing meditation? That is kind of what people tend to report. It's like, I'm more here. I'm more embodied. I'm more connected. My thinking is clearer. I'm more aware of when I'm not here. Like all these things that suggest it's not about being a amazing breath follower. It's about translating it into your life so that it is more attentive to everything that you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah. Have you witnessed or experienced anything that you would deem to be a miracle in your life? Or some spontaneous shift in the brain or in the body or in some form of dis-ease in a person's world or
I probably wouldn't characterize something as a miracle in that way, but yeah, nothing's totally weird comes to mind. But there's certainly people I've talked to where they'd say events have occurred that don't make sense, right?
yeah.
And people I trust where I'm like, what? Things like being able to see events and predict the mind of another in another time and place with a lot
Right.
of precision,
Yeah.
or connections to someone else's, the inner workings of somebody else's mind, which you would not be privy to. And when those kinds of things happen, it gives me deep pause because it makes me realize, and I keep this humility front and center in my mind, like, we don't have a freaking clue how any of this works. We are
Yeah.
barely understanding it. And there are points and events that occur that make you very concerned that our model for how reality occurs, how the brain functions, what consciousness is, may be completely off. So I don't
Yeah.
shy away from that. I respect that is going to be my limitation. So, I mean, I'm a student of that journey.
Yeah. There's something that I got from Richard Davidson, who is someone that you studied, with a while ago from
Yeah,
listening
he's the
to.
one that said the term meditation that kind of shifted me to opening up about it.
Right. And one of the things that a quote or a paraphrase quote from him was that we're wired to learn compassion the same way that we're wired to learn linguistics or language. And I think that I wonder with when we have the sensation of like telepathy, when there's one kind of telepathy that I think that happens when you're like in a room with a person, and you're gathering, millions of bits of information based off of their postural patterns and their facial gestures and maybe dilation of their pupils and just all these little things that consciously you might not even notice, but subconsciously like, oh, you're like,
Yeah.
and I think that there's a really interesting thing that happens that we kind of get played by each other, like we attune to each other. And if you can be, and I think that part of that, like that's the way that you learn language as well. You learn language just by being around language. And I think it's such an interesting thing to open ourselves up to be able to feel each other. And I don't know, I don't think I actually have a question. I just think that's
No,
really
I think
interesting.
it is very true. In fact, I just did a talk for the Dalai Lama Summit. The topic was compassion, and I was struck by the fact that they wanted an attention researcher to talk about compassion because it's not central to what I study. But one thing that is absolutely true in everything you just said is that if you're not paying attention at some level, the chances of you extending that kind of care are less.
Hmm.
So my topic was essentially that kindness and compassion begin by paying attention. It's the first act of actually extending that kind of care to another person.
Hmm. That's so beautiful. Well, I'm so excited to read your book. I'm so sorry that I haven't read it yet. I wasn't sent, not to make any excuses, but I wasn't sent a copy and
Oh
it's not out
no,
yet. If there
I
was
gotta
some way
get you a
to get a
copy.
hold
That's
of it,
for
I would have
sure.
loved to have checked it out. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can't wait to
yeah,
get it. Yeah.
absolutely. I'll make sure that happens.
Can you give a general, I know you already kind of did, but a general summary of like who's the book for? What's the, like,
The book is
who should
really
get the book?
right. The book is really for everyone. I mean, whether it's somebody who's in a high stress job or feels like they have a high stress life, for personal or family demands, who really wants to deal with some kind of crisis of attention. And I frankly think that unfortunately that's too many of us.
Yeah.
And use the tools of mindfulness in a way that can bring about more fulfillment and more productivity.
Yeah. No, the last thing, well, maybe the last thing. Do you have to go right at 4?
I
You have
do.
a hard. Okay, okay. All
Yeah.
right. Well, then never mind. We'll just wrap up. Maybe we can do this again. Because this
I
is
really would like you to
my.
read the book. I'm so sorry you didn't get a copy yet.
Oh no, it's all good. But this is my favorite type of conversation. So I so greatly appreciate you making time
Oh, yeah. This
to
was a lot of fun. You asked such great
to do.
questions. It's easy.
Oh, good. That's great. Yeah, your responses they like get all the wheels whirling. Where should people go from here then? Where's the best location?
Yeah, they can find out about my book and my research at amishi.com, AMISHI.com.
Great. And book is Amazon a likely place to grab it?
Yeah, and you can find all the different links for local bookstores, etc., on the same website.
Beautiful. And your social media is?
Amishi Jha.
Perfect. I love the name. All right. I greatly appreciate you. This was so beautiful. Thank you so much for making time. And I'm sure we both had some neuroplastic changes throughout
I feel
this.
like I did. I grew.
I feel like we're growing. All right. I appreciate you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for tuning in. Over and out.
All right.
All right.